Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. As I mentioned before, season two, we are kicking off with some wonderful guests. Today, we have an amazing guest with us today. His name is Ken Swann. He was a field representative for the IRC meaning the International Rescue Committee on the Khmer Rouge, a few of the big important Khmer Rouge camps at the time. So he worked directly with the refugees on the field, helping them on a daily basis as a volunteer. And I really wanted to bring him on to have his voice be heard and offer his perspective on what exactly he witnessed at that time. Ken, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dorothy. Good to be here.
So why don't we start off with some, basic introduction. How did you end up in Thailand with the Peace Corps at
Mhm.
first, and eventually working as a field rep for the IRC?
Sure. Well, a long time ago, in 1977, I had been working in a television station in Colorado. I had accumulated a lot of leave time and I had to use it or lose it. So I had never been to Asia. I'd lived in Europe on two different occasions, but I thought I'll buy a ticket and go to Asia. So I went to Japan and I was amazed. Japan is an amazing place now. It was amazing then. And when I
Hmm.
got back to the US, I thought I would really like to work in Asia. How can I do that? So Peace Corps came to mind. And so I applied and I was offered a job in Bangkok. It wasn't a small village out in the middle of nowhere. I lived in a big city working at a medical university, Mahidol University. Um, I stayed with the Peace Corps for a bit over a year. At that time, the refugee problem started to boil up. We heard in the news, it was quite limited then, not like today, but we heard in the news that there were these camps along the border. I had a fellow Peace Corps friend who worked on the Thai border with Cambodia in a city called Aranyapathet, which is just across
Hmm.
from Phet in Cambodia. He worked at the hospital, the district hospital. So I went up and visited him frequently. And because of that, I got to know the people who were already working for IRC. They had a couple of nurses and a doctor and Thai staff working in probably the camp your father was in, and also another camp called Tapia. These were
Hmm.
border camps. They were literally straddling the border between Thailand and Cambodia. But because I got to know these people, when the big refugee influx happened and I was now looking for a job after the Peace Corps, the director of IRC asked me, would you like a job? We need someone who can speak Thai. So I said, sure, not knowing what it was, but going from about $120 a month in the Peace Corps to $1,000 a month, I thought, this is great. You can't get any better than this. So I joined the International Rescue Committee, as you said, as the field representative. And what had happened at that point, this would have been October 79.
Hmm. That's when you started, Ken?
That's
What
when
was
I
your time
started.
frame? Okay.
I started with IRC in October 79. I
Okay.
joined the Peace Corps in early 78.
Okay.
What had happened up to that point, the Vietnamese were moving across Cambodia in pursuit of the Khmer Rouge. And they were just pressed up against the border, masses of people. And they started coming into Thailand. And the Thai government realized we have a big problem on our hands because we don't know if the Vietnamese are going to pursue the Khmer Rouge on into Thailand as well. So
Hmm.
the Thai government contacted the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, looking for support to set up a camp away from the border. So that was the first camp that was set up about, I think, 40, 45 kilometers inside Thailand in a district, which is now a province, but a district called Sakeo.
So backtracking here a little bit, in total, how long did you work with the IRC for?
Oh gosh, close to 2 years in Sakeo camp, and then two more small Khmer camps, and then I guess I was burned out. They moved me up to Nong Khai in northeast Thailand, which was a Laotian camp, a Lao refugee camp.
Okay. And so when you got called to be a field representative for the IRC, you mentioned just now that the news wasn't really like how it is now, and so you didn't know that much about what was happening. You knew somewhat.
I
Is
knew
that right?
somewhat, yeah, because
Right.
my friend, my fellow Peace Corps volunteer who was at the border, of course, the Peace Corps was concerned about his security and safety. And so he was up to date more than volunteers who were not on the border. Having said
So,
that, go
right.
ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so I can only imagine the shock that that you must have experienced when you actually got to the camps and to see what was really happening there.
Yeah, well, for sure, because I grew up in a middle class family in a middle class suburb. I had a blessed life. I lived in Europe, like I said, on a couple of occasions, and now I was living and working in Bangkok at a medical university, which is the premier medical school in Thailand. So I wasn't in
Right.
a difficult situation. And then 24 hours after I agreed to the job, I end up walking through the gates of Sakkeo, probably on day 2 or 3 of its getting started. Shock, disbelief, dismay. I mean, think of the worst, movie about the Holocaust you've ever seen. That's what it looked like, except it was people in Southeast Asia. Um, the camp, after about 2 weeks, I think there were probably 30,000 people in the camp. The Thai government kept bringing people in on trucks and putting in this area, which in normal times would have just been rice field. Okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
low, it's flat, scrubland, and it's the tail end of the rainy season, the monsoon season, and it's a mess. It's mud. People were handed sheets of plastic and bamboo posts, and they set up little hovels, basically little huts to live underneath. There was a hospital set up. Um, Everything was on the ground. There were no beds. There were just mats. The hospital was out of bamboo and plastic. There were a handful of doctors at the beginning. IRC, the International Rescue Committee, had a couple of doctors that had been working with them for years in those camps on the border that I mentioned. So they moved them to Sakeo. In the meantime, they brought in a contingent of doctors and nurses from the Bay Area, from Francisco,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm originally from, by the way. And a lot of my work was logistics, helping the doctors get from the airport in Bangkok up to Sakeo, get them in a hotel, then get them a house, get them into the camp, get them the proper IDs with the Thai authorities, rent, buy equipment that they needed in the hospital. Basically, I was a gopher. Field representative sounds kind of cool, but basically, they told me do this and I did that. But it also
Mm-hmm.
included every morning, because at nighttime, in the evening, the Thai military would close the camp. All of the expats had to leave, the doctors, the nurses, as well as Thais. We had to leave the camp. They locked down the camp. You'd go back the next morning, 6 or 7 in the morning, and the first job you did during the first few weeks basically was collecting bodies, because people were in such a horrible state physically and mentally. People were suffering from malaria, from nutrition, anemia. Um, People were just dying, literally dying in front of your eyes. I mean, to say it was shocking is an understatement. It was unbelievable. Um, there was
The IRC, were they the only, can you go ahead, can you name the biggest organizations that had the biggest impact on saving the refugees' lives at the time? IRC, I'm sure, but who else was there?
the International Committee for the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, the American Refugee Committee, the Thai Red Cross, CARE, Save the Children,
Hmm.
Food for the Hungry. I mean, after a few weeks, it really did bring in a lot of workers. But
Hmm.
initially, in those first few days, especially, it was quite horrific. There weren't that many aid workers, and the camp was actually being more controlled at night by the Khmer Rouge, because you have to understand, you couldn't look at this mass of people and say, Khmer citizen, Khmer Rouge soldier, soldiers. You didn't know because everyone looked the same. Black
Hmm.
shirt, black trousers, red karma scarf. Everyone was pretty emaciated, malnutrition, Having said that, you could always probably tell the soldiers a little bit by the phrase, if looks could kill.
Hmm.
The hate, the anger, the distrust they stared at you with was quite scary at times. And they were probably a little bit better physically. They had, as your father could attest to, they had better food rations for the last 5 years during the rule of the Khmer Rouge. And they're important for the ONCA, the organization, the Khmer Rouge structure. They had to keep these people happy and healthy.
So
But
you can pick them out right away, who the Khmer Rouge soldiers were and
after a
who.
couple of days, you figured it out quickly, yes. And
Was it
you,
scary being
it was
around
very,
their presence?
I didn't feel scared in the sense that during daylight hours they were going, I'd never gotten away with that. There were Thai
Right.
military guarding the camp, and they would have come in and handled that. But I wouldn't have gone in the camp at night. No, it was bad. And people were, if you, if a Khmer refugee got too close to an aid worker, there was retribution. They would beat them up, they would threaten them, they would kill them.
Mm.
But in the
So,
first few days and weeks, sanitation was a huge place to do your normal bodily functions. There was no place to bathe. So a lot of the work that IRC did was bringing in a water supply system, setting up trench latrines outside of the camp, um, bathing facilities, and the IRC also, I believe, provided a lot of care in pediatrics as well, setting up food
mm,
programs for young kids, that sort of thing.
right, right. I think a lot of when you mention kids, a lot of our listeners have actually been born in these camps. And so I was always curious what that process really was like. How was the birth giving process like in the camps? If did they have enough supplies, and how close were you? You mentioned you were kind of a gopher, but can you draw on some experiences when you talk about things not being sanitary and talking about also just kids and yeah, if you had ever witnessed or seen what that process of birth giving was like in the camps?
Okay, you have to divide it between the two main camps that I worked in. So this first camp I'm
Sure.
talking about, Sakeo, was in an emergency situation. There were births there for sure. A lot of the births were attended to by, I think the Khmer word is chamop, midwives. So traditional
Hmm.
midwives from the villages who were amongst this group of 30,000 people. But as started coming in more, they were setting up maternity wards in this makeshift hospital. So there was there were Western trained doctors and nurses to attend to births. But for a lot of these women, I'm sure there were stillbirths, there were miscarriages, because they were in such horrible physical condition. They couldn't really sustain a full-term pregnancy. Jumped ahead a few more months when they eventually opened up a bigger camp that they had had a longer time to prepare called Kauai, which was closer to the border but not on the border, so in that sense, and north of Aranyapatet town. They had better facilities. So the midwifery was still there, but also they were
Hmm.
accompanied by Western midwives. And then there was a better maternal care facility within Khao Idang. There were surgical wards in Khao Idang. So if a woman was having complications with her pregnancy or in birth, there was a much greater chance of her surviving and having a live birth, and survived. At the same time, in difficult situations, the Thai government allowed for people to be taken out of the camps and taken to the district hospitals. And if you compare a district hospital in Thailand in those days to today, there's a huge gap in quality. But in those days, if you compare the Thai district hospital to what was available in the camp, it's like going to Johns Hopkins. You know,
Hmm.
it's a huge difference. So it was a difficult situation, not just for women who were pregnant and needed medical care, but everyone in general. Food, nutrition, dengue, malaria, Japanese encephalitis, as well as the violence that was happening in the camps because of the Khmer Rouge.
Hmm. And the most, you mentioned malaria several times. So all these doctors, what was the most common thing that they were trying to, what was the most common disease that they would see throughout the camps, and or what was the thing they were working on the most?
Initially, malaria for sure. Any vector-borne disease, malaria, dengue fever. Um, but the big problem really was malnutrition. As your father has said, they didn't have any food. People were starved, close to death. And so when these people poured across the border, they were suffering horribly from lack of food. But the other big problem had nothing to do with that physical health, but to do with the trauma of war. People coming in. I mean, I had never seen things on television, but I'd never seen up close people's arms blown off, legs blown off, people stepping on landmines, or Vietnamese were busy shelling the border camps.
Hmm.
So every day people would be brought into the camp that it would have been a trauma triage, basically putting a mark on this person, get them into the OR because we can save them, or this person, there's really no hope. So there were the problems of disease, dengue, malnutrition, but then there was the problem of war wounds, the trauma of artillery and landmines.
So how many doctors would they assign? And I don't know how they did it and how they organized it, but how many doctors did they assign per group of people, or how many doctors did we all really have for the camps?
Uh, in terms of, okay, when Sakeo began, there were
Right.
probably only a handful of doctors that were pulled from various border camps. IRC was working in the border camps. Catholic Relief Services was working in the border. They probably brought them in. Uh, I would say less than a half a dozen doctors and nurses in Sakeo for anywhere from 6,000 up to 30,000 people over a period of a few weeks. Um, After that, for example, when the Bay Area Medical Response Team flew in, um, I shouldn't laugh here, but it was kind of funny. I think they had grown up watching MASH on television. So I think they thought they were going to be helicoptered out to this camp, and they were all wearing camouflage stuff with canteens hanging on their webbing. And they were
With
in for a
music in the
huge,
background.
yeah. So they shock. They had absolutely no idea. These were doctors who probably came from private practices in San Francisco or Marin County, or, they weren't used to people walking into their nice office with their arm blown off. Okay, so
This is not
uh,
yeah,
and
emergency. Yeah,
emergency medical care, uh,
right.
to that extent. To that extent, um, we had, it must have been in that group alone at least a half a dozen or more doctors and probably a dozen or more nurses. We had blood bank specialists, because that was another thing the IRC did, was they got involved in setting up a very rudimentary blood bank. We had people who, like me, former volunteers, came in and worked on this. But we did have a couple of cases. The trauma wasn't only among the Khmer population. We had trauma among these Western doctors. Some doctors just, they burned out. They couldn't take it anymore. And
Mm.
I ended up driving them back down to Bangkok and the airport. They couldn't take it. It was quite shocking for people, to say the least.
Can you recall one of the most horrible things that you had witnessed in your time as a field representative?
I would say it was in those first few days of going into the camps in the morning and having to pick up dead people and move them over off to the side to an area that was designated sort of a preparation area before they were taken for cremation. Uh, there are always Watts pagodas, and so the Thai temples, the Thai Watts, were opened up to allow proper Buddhist ceremonies to take place for these people to be cremated. That was one thing that you know, was actually, I became enamored, basically jaded by it. I had to do it. It wasn't just the team. That was sort of the first task of the day. But it also included people that had been assaulted by the Khmer Rouge during the night for, like I said, getting too close to people, to foreigners, to Westerners. Because this hospital that was initially set up, they needed people to help them within the hospital. So they recruited anyone who had a background in Cambodia, please step forward. Because as I'm sure your father told you, if you were a doctor during the Khmer Rouge times, that was like a death sentence, right? They wanted to
Hmm.
get rid of you.
Right.
So everyone just
Absolutely.
kept their heads down. But of course, they
Right.
survived and they were in this camp. So there were Khmer refugees who had been trained as nurses or doctors or midwives brought in to help with this very basic hospital. The other thing that I witnessed that was something I'll never forget is the war wounds, the injuries, people being ripped open by shrapnel. And let me back up just a little bit. But I studied mass communication. I work in photojournalism. I studied photojournalism, TV production. And my dream was to become a war photographer along the lines of Robert Capa or David Douglas Duncan or Larry Burroughs. And I still had that dream up until that point. And when I saw what getting too close to the front lines can do to you, I thought, probably isn't for me, you know. And I ended up changing my course and using media in development work later on. So
Did you have a camera at the time? I don't think
I
it's part of
did,
your
I
job.
did. I walked around with about 3 Nikon bodies and several lenses, and I had
Wow.
tons of stills and tons of slides. And after 43 years of moving around Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia, moving, changing houses, I don't know. This would be a treasure to have all of these images, but
Oh, darn. I was just gonna ask.
I was afraid you would ask me that. Yeah.
So, this time span that you were working at about 2 years, I could only imagine for you. You talk about the mental burnout that these doctors had experienced. I can only imagine after 2 years of being kind of a field gopher and seeing this on a daily basis, you must have had to had experienced some burnout too, as the rest of the medic, anybody else who
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah. I wasn't in the operating room. I wasn't always in the clinic. Like you said, I was moving around a lot.
Right.
Um, Probably in Saqueo, I was there for a few months. And then because basically it was such, like I said, it was a lowland, poor drainage, bad place to be during the rainy season. People actually drowned in Saqueo in rains. Like I
Oh,
said,
wow.
malnutrition. They were too weak to get up and get out of the rainwater and mud, and they died from drowning. So the UNHCR approached the Thai government and said, "Hey, we need to find a better site." And the Thai government was actually because the Thai government had supported the Americans during the Vietnam War. There were Thai troops in Vietnam fighting alongside the Americans, and the Thai government allowed the Americans to put it, I think it may be a dozen, maybe to a dozen air bases throughout Thailand that they used to fly bombing missions to Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia from. So the Thais were a bit worried if we have all of these 30,000 Khmer here, including Khmer Rouge, maybe the Vietnamese will want to come all the way 40 kilometers into Thailand. So the Thais were happy to move this camp. So they built Khao
Hmm.
Idang, which was probably 5 kilometers from the border, but in a better land. It was sloping, so you had natural drainage, you had a better water supply, and the UNHCR and other agencies had a few weeks to set this place up. They graded roads, they basically built a city. Khao Idang at one time was the largest Khmer city, bigger than Phnom Penh in terms of number of people living there.
Hmm.
And it was sort of like a suburb, but a refuge suburb. It was divided up into blocks. There were streets. It was a big grid pattern. There was proper drainage. There was proper sanitation facilities. Proper in terms of there were pit private. There were showering, bathing areas, or cooking, communal cooking areas. There were schools. There was a much better hospital facilities. They did X-rays. They did surgery. There was a dental
Wow.
facility. They started to revive the Khmer arts, the Ramayan, the dancing, the singing, everything. When I shifted from from Sakeo to Khao Idang, my role changed a bit from being less of a gopher. I still had that to a degree, but the International Rescue Committee had been contracted by the UNHCR to prepare something called the Unaccompanied Minor Handbook.
Right.
So this was a book that became quite thick, of any Khmer young person under 18 years of age who had come into Thailand without a parent, without a grandparent, without an aunt, an uncle, without any guardian, adult. And the idea was, let's publish this book and try and get parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to find their son or grandson or nephew. And so I worked with a Khmer translator. He spoke Khmer and I spoke Thai. And we went around the camp and I photographed all of these young Khmer kids from babies all the way up to 18 years old. And then we collected biodata on them: name, place of birth, last village they lived in, parents' name, grandparents' name, siblings, if any, what their names are, anything we could come up with. And all of that was compiled into this huge book, which was the first volume, because after I left, after my burnout, then we continued, IRC continued with other editions of this. It was not done only in Khao Idang, but I also went down to camps, very small camps, only a few thousand people, in the province called Trang, next to
Mm-hmm.
Kong in Cambodia. It's where Thailand becomes very thin, next to
Mm-hmm.
Cambodia. A place called Mairut and another one called Kamput. And I did the same biodata photo collection there as well.
Right.
Um,
So there were many camps, and just kind of let people, yeah, just kind of reiterate what you had just mentioned. This is to join orphans, people with no right? Is that right? Orphans well, I wouldn't say orphans, but
yeah,
kids who had lost
yes.
their family members along the way and then
People had
are in
become
hope,
separated.
right, have become separated, and so
Right,
therefore are trying to find their parents amongst the camps. And so,
right.
did you ever get to witness any of these kids get reunited with their families?
I did not know, but I know from a year or so later, speaking with RC, that there had been some level of success. But, I mean, sadly, the truth is a lot of people's parents were gone, and
Mm-hmm.
grandparents and siblings. So, I mean, people I met in the camps, Khmer people in the camps, told me, you know, basically it's a good gesture, great level of success, because so many people, their parents are gone. Especially if you're a young kid, parents worked for the Lon Nol government or the Sihanouk government. They would have
Right,
been prime targets if you were police, if you were
right,
military, if you were working in any government ministry, you were a target. And even if you were suspected for the smallest false thing, you were a target. So although
right,
it was a good idea, it had to be done, the Unaccompanied Minor Handbook. It's hard to say now what level of success they had. Let me
right.
back up just a little bit. I forgot. I wanted to mention something about Sakeo camp, that first camp that was set up 40 kilometers in Thailand, that had citizens, right?
Right.
Pachia Khmer, as opposed to the Khmer Rouge. Eventually, because of the trauma and trouble that was going on in this camp because of the Khmer Rouge, the UNHCR got the agree to move these people out. Now, exactly how they separated them, I don't know, but they separated the Khmer Rouge, put them on big military trucks, the Thai government, and hauled them up around the border, if you can imagine the Thai map, northeast Thailand to probably Buriram and Surin and Sisaket provinces, which border Cambodia, that northern part of Cambodia.
Right.
And they didn't push them back. The Khmer Rouge were happy to go back into Cambodia and continue the fight with the Vietnamese. So it was basically killing two birds with one stone. You got the Khmer Rouge out of the camps, which were a threat to the Khmer refugees, and the Thai government was happy to see them go back into Cambodia and be a bit of a buffer between Thailand and the Vietnamese.
Yeah, and I want to make this very clear because there was a lot of focus when we say the Préfier, everyone always thinks about Préfier being that horrific event that we all know of,
Yeah, no,
which I
this
had
was,
mentioned on the podcast.
yeah,
So, but this is not the case.
no,
You are
this is a
saying
year, yeah, this is after that.
this is after that, so that there was movement of the refugees up to the north area um, for to so that they can kind of kill two birds with one stone, as you
Yeah,
mentioned.
not the refugees. Again, you have to make the distinction. There were the Khmer refugees like your father, but then
I
there,
see.
there were the Khmer Rouge,
I see. I
who
see.
were, and so they were the ones that were moved up willingly. They weren't forced. They wanted to
Hmm.
get back in and the Vietnamese.
So I want to get back into because I know our listeners are really going to be interested in hearing a more perspective on just things that you saw, what the experience really was like on the field. And you mentioned a big difference between the Sakau and Khao
Mhm.
and there you were in Sakau for how many months
I think it was
again?
about 3 months. It was well into the dry season, so
Okay. Okay.
yeah, 4 3 4 months, yeah.
And then after that you moved to Khao which
Right.
which had many more,
Cal-
much more funding and different,
It was
way better
yeah,
setups.
it was day and night. Again, Khao Dang
Right.
was set up once the UNHCR and the Royal Thai government signed the contract. The UN brought in someone. Uh, some of the existing NGOs that were already working in Cambodia, in Thailand, some of them working in the border camps. They moved some of their people into Sakeo, but it really was, we're talking about a dozen aid workers in this camp that was soon reaching 30,000 people. Um,
So I think it's also good to mention though, because there were a lot of these smaller camps that weren't able to get the attention that I think Kawi Dong did. That
right,
I feel like were very much more similar to the experience of Sakau versus Kawi Dang, which had all, a dentistry and many more doctors. So I wanted to focus a little bit on Sakau a bit. You mentioned sanitary thing, it was not sanitary. I mean, from a third party perspective, do you really think was it humane even seeing how they were living? And what was the aura in there really? Were they happy? Were they sad? What were they feeling from what you saw?
on one hand, I would say they were relieved, especially once they got separated from the Khmer Rouge.
Right.
They knew they had a place to stay that was relatively safe. They were getting food every day. I mean, not gourmet meal, but they were getting more food than they had had for the past 5 years under the Khmer Rouge. And there was health care, albeit it was there. They were getting medications.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think there was relief that maybe eventually, especially once they moved into the better camp, the county, there was hope. But at the same time, there had to be in these people's minds, especially the adults, wondering just, what in the hell is going to happen with my life now? They can't go back to Cambodia because there's a war going on there between the Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge. And they can't go into Thailand. The Thais are, 150, 200,000 people, refugees, just sort of come into Thailand. The Thais at that time was still a poor country as well, especially that part of Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
So they were, I'm sure the adults were kind of despondent. What's going to happen to us? For the kids, it was probably okay once they got a bit healthier and they were playing football and running around like kids do. But for
Mm-hmm.
the adults, it must have been quite sad and depressing because in
Mm-hmm.
Sakeo there still wasn't a program of sending refugees on to a third country. That hadn't happened yet. That really didn't get started until Khao Dung got set up.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One thing that happened is that Rosalind Carter, the wife of President Jimmy Carter, she paid a
Yes.
visit to Thailand. So I think that probably helped focus a lot of U.S. attention on what was going on in Cambodia. Because, like you said, prior to Sakeo, and even then when state started, I don't think there was much knowledge of that. And certainly with the border camps had been there for years. When the Khmer
Mm-hmm.
Rouge came in 75, when they won in Cambodia, April 75, there were already camps getting started on the Thai-Cambodian border. And
Mm-hmm.
even before that, there were Khmer camps that were resistance camps against the royal regime, even
Mm-hmm.
predating the Khmer Rouge. So there's a
Right.
history of these border camps the world knew nothing about. Me, as a young Peace Corps volunteer in Bangkok, I knew nothing about it. So when Rosalind Carter showed up, helped to raise the ability of this a bit, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and probably helped kicking a bit more hope among the refugees, especially the adults, in that, well, maybe now the international community is looking at us. And also another high-profile visitor made a visit to Sakeo, which is Joan Baez. And she gave a little mini concert in the camp. I think the people had no idea what was going on. But,
Were
you know,
you there when
I wasn't there for the concert, but I was there, I stood around 3 meters away from her. I didn't shake her hand. It was 3 degrees of separation, basically. Um, but she came in, I think, through the auspices of IRC. The IRC is based
Mhm.
in New York, by the way, International
Yeah.
Rescue Committee. Um, yeah, so
How
how was the general aura of the camp once the Rouge were out of the camp? It picked up. People smiled, engaged with you a lot more, engaged with foreigners, Westerners a lot more. And I think the hope meter just ticked up a little bit higher. But still,
Mhm.
people were, what's next?
Right. How did they decide who got to move where? For example, from Sakau to Kaohsiung? Was there an
Ev-
order?
Well, everyone was going to move eventually. I don't know if, they did it
Okay.
by blocks, just geographically within the camp. This block goes first, this block second.
Mhm.
But once they got the Khmer Rouge out, and once Khao Idang, the infrastructure had been put in place, then they started moving people over. So within a matter of days, Sakeo became just an empty field again, full of
Mhm.
plastic sheeting and bamboo, but no people.
Mhm.
Um, and now it probably built over that as a big shopping mall. I mean,
Mhm.
43 years later has really changed. But once they were in Khao Idang, then the process started up where getting refugees placed overseas in third countries. So America was a huge destination, France a huge destination because of the influence, negative influence, I would say, that America and France had on Cambodia, France being a colonial power in Cambodia,
Right.
and America being military power. I mean, America bombed
Right.
the hell out of eastern Cambodia, America, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through
Right.
eastern Cambodia, so that's where
Right.
America bombed. So America and France were the big recipients of refugees, but also Australia was a big recipient, Canada, probably Sweden, Norway, Scandinavian countries, yeah.
What would you say were some of your more dangerous tasks? Were there any dangerous tasks really that you were given during that time period?
driving people from Bangkok up to the camp. The roads are very dangerous. Uh, Seriously, I never felt in danger in the camp.
Right, okay.
I did feel, okay, there's a possibility for danger within Sakgale because you're around,
Right.
like I said, if these people had a knife or a club or a gun and they could get away with it, these Khmer Rouge would have done me in. And so that was a bit worrying. But beyond that, I
Mhm.
never really felt in any danger. And what blew me away was how friendly the Khmer people were. I mean, even in this destitute situation of not knowing what's going to happen a day from now, being stuck in this camp, they were just very friendly people, very warm,
Mhm.
friendly people.
Mhm.
Um, and very early on, I had read a book before I went to Thailand in the Peace Corps. When I found out I was going to go to Thailand, I tried to find books in the public library in Colorado Springs. What's Thailand? Where's Thailand? And it was very limited information in those days. But I did come across a book. It had just come into print called Cambodia Year Zero. And it's one of the first books published about the Khmer Rouge history, the Khmer Rouge times. And it was published by a French priest, Catholic priest called
Mhm.
Francois, and now I can't pronounce French, but I think it's something like that. And I met him on several occasions. He had been in Phnom Penh when Phnom Penh fell to the Khmer Rouge. He had held up in the French embassy for a couple of weeks, and he was one of the last Westerners to get out of Cambodia. And after to Thailand and started working in the camps as well. Met him on several occasions. We'd have lunch or dinner together, and I asked him, Father Francois, what in the hell happened? Why did the Khmer Rouge happen? Why did Khmer kill Khmer? What's going on? Because they're such lovely people. And he said he really can't explain it. He doesn't know what happened to the psyche of this group of people that formed the Khmer Rouge, and then brainwashed all of these young people out in the villages and the sticks to follow them and do what they did. So, getting back to your question, I never felt danger in the camp because I never felt danger amongst coming from the Khmer people. And to this
Mhm.
day, unfortunately during COVID, but every year I go to Cambodia once or twice or thrice a year, and I go to villages. I go on bicycle tours around the countryside. I've never felt threatened. Most people just want to stop you and talk, and why in the hell are you riding your bicycle out here? It's too hot. Uh, but they're just very, very friendly people. So
So, focusing back on Dang, then it must have been almost very relieving, but also heartwarming to see the communities slowly kind of get back together. You mentioned dance and music and um, people starting to kids acting like kids again.
mhm.
Uh, what else? Yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that? It must have just felt. What did you feel kind of witnessing that regrowth of the community?
Yeah, no, after Sakeo, I mean, every one of us were very happy. The IRC was involved a lot in developments of setting up schools,
Hmm.
nutrition centers. But you could see that all of this misery, there is this seed of hope. And you're hoping that this family that I've gotten to know, maybe they'll make it to the US or maybe they'll make it to Australia. On the other hand, part of us were thinking, but it would be nice if they could go back to Cambodia and revive Cambodia because
Hmm.
otherwise, you're diluting this rich culture. So probably amongst, I know from Lao refugees that I knew in the US when I went back to the children of the refugees, whether they're born in the US or if they just leave this camp as infant, quite often they don't learn the language and they don't
Hmm.
necessarily learn. They become very Americanized. I mean, I grew up in
Hmm.
San Francisco in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of my friends were Chinese American kids, and their parents were from Taiwan or Hong Kong or somewhere in mainland China. The parents spoke Chinese about 100% of the time. They didn't know Chinese at all. And so
Mm-hmm.
you're in Khao Idang and you're people, this hope is starting to build. You're very happy for them and positive for them. You'd like them to go back, you'd like them to go overseas to a safer environment, but at the same time, you're thinking, but what will happen?
Mm-hmm.
So when you saw all of this happening, the theater starting and the music starting and the starting, that was great. They're not going to lose it, at least if they stay in the camp and if they go back to Cambodia. But what will happen if they go beyond that? So.
Mm-hmm. 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 Um, do you think that the help that Cowidan got, was it enough to suffice the amount of population that was there?
Well, any situation could be better for sure, but that there are other things going on in the world, other things going on in Africa, in South America,
Mm-hmm.
Central America. I, countries, most governments, especially the Scandinavians and the Dutch, gave well beyond their capacity. They really did. They donated
Right.
in cash and in kind. They would help set up the medical facilities, surgical equipment, machinery, X-ray machines, set up blood banks, all of this stuff.
Wow.
Could it have been more? I guess you could say yes. Bring more. But at some point, you see on one hand the Thai government is seeing all of this aid coming into the camps, but the Thai government on their own can't provide equitable aid to Thai villages outside of the camp. So you're trying to find
Mm-hmm.
this balance somehow. And a good example of that is after I finished doing the first edition of the Unaccompanied Minor Handbook, IRC said, okay, we're going to give you a break now. And they moved me up to Nong Khai, which is up in northeast Thailand on the Mekong River across from Vientiane, across from
Mm-hmm.
Vientiane, Laos. That was a Laotian refugee camp. And it was a lot more laid back there, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the agreements that we had, IRC had with the Thai government for IRC to work inside this Laotian camp, we had to do sort of equal work out in Thai villages in the province. So
Mm-hmm.
my job was more outside of the camp, working as an interpreter for we had a Filipino doctor and an American nurse. Yeah. So I would go out with them during the day, along with Thai public health staff, and administer to Thai villagers because the
Mm-hmm.
Thai government felt, well, it's not fair that all this, high-tech care for these refugees where we can't provide the same for our own citizens. So there was this balance we had to make. Uh,
Sure, sure.
so,
No, and I think
so
that goes to show how much help we actually had then, at
yeah,
that time, at a certain point, which was great, allowing the refugees to have these, as you say, high tech medical devices and stuff. I think that's really wonderful.
and
Uh,
also, like I said before, if there were serious cases within the camp that
right.
the staff and facilities couldn't deal with, they were quite often allowed to go into the Thai district hospital or maybe even the provincial hospital up the road. So
Hmm.
it was
Hmm.
available.
Did you ever get close to any of the refugees that you helped personally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in Thai, I haven't been in touch with them for years, but yes, the ones that spoke Thai, because at that
Hmm.
point I didn't speak Khmer. Now I speak Khmer. But,
Hmm. Hmm.
I learned how to say "Ak kun jo to," and,
Hmm.
very, very basic stuff, "Cham riep suor." But
Hmm.
I always work through a Khmer Thai interpreter because a lot of Khmer, especially Khmer from the border regions, Banteay Minche and Prevahir, that whole area, they speak Thai. A lot of villagers speak Thai, not extra where we could communicate. So
Hmm.
I worked with 3 or 4 different fellows in the camps, and so I sort of developed a relationship with them. I think they eventually moved on to a third country, That was
Mm-hmm.
the other thing that happened. After I left, this camp size started going because people were starting to go off it as refugees to third countries, but there was still a core of people that were left behind. And, I don't know why not everyone was moved out of the camps into a third country, but some weren't, and they were eventually repatriated back into Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I moved to Cambodia in 1997. I worked in Cambodia for 5 years, lived there. And there, I met a lot of people there who had been, like your father, refugees, survived the Khmer Rouge, got into a camp in Thailand, but then ended up coming back to Cambodia, not of their own choice necessarily, in Cambodia. Um, and they felt lucky that they survived, but they probably wish that they had had their ticket punched and had gone on to, you know, Paris or someplace in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. or something. But they were professional people now working within NGOs in Cambodia. So,
Yeah, you needed to be a, sponsor in order to get out. From my research at least, you needed a sponsor to help you get out, and if you didn't have a sponsor, then you were basically left. So
mm,
it is a privilege, to be sponsored, and so um, from from your experience in total, these 2 years, you had mentioned that after 2 years you started to feel a little burnout. Is that right? Is that the reason why you stopped?
the reason I stopped, well, I did feel a bit exhausted. It was exhausting work. It was long days, and it wasn't. Oh, I have the weekend now. I'm going to kick back. It was 7 days a week
Right.
for most of that 2 years, especially in the beginning. Uh, but then when they moved me up to the Laotian camp in Northeast, after I finished that work, and that camp started to close down as well. I
Mm,
could have gone back and continued working in the camps, but the camps were starting to need less help from people like me and more help from medical professionals and social workers.
mhm.
Uh, so I asked my boss, what should I do? And he said, well, when in school. so, so I went back to the US. I ended up getting a grant and studying at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I did a degree in Southeast Asian Studies and Development Communications. When I finished my coursework and thesis was accepted, I bought a ticket, got on a plane, and came back to Thailand and found a job with a small American NGO working at the Association of the Deaf in Thailand.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
Not the first audio visual unit, but it was the first visual unit because the audio unit wouldn't have had any use with the deaf community. Published sign language videotapes, and we did newsletters, and we did fundraising for the National Association of the Deaf. It's where I met my wife,
Sure.
um, and
So
then
going back, what was your biggest lesson that you took away from the experience that you had as a field representative? What would you say?
I guess maybe it's cliche, but I would have to say it's hope. Even in the most miserable setting, if you get over that initial shock, and it was shock and despair, can I deal with this? And if you support each other, your people, we can get through this. We can make it better. And for me, I mean, I can walk out of the camp every day. I could walk off the job and go back to Bangkok and stay in a nice place. But what I saw was that seed of hope even existed among the Khmer refugees that had been through hell, been through, experienced things. And even though your father talks about it, it's really hard to imagine. It really is hard to imagine. I might be in a little better position because I saw the aftermath of that horror, that trauma. But even after all of that, I think I have hope and move on from it. And that's what you see today in Cambodia. Compared to 20 years ago when I left Cambodia after living there for 5 years, it's a miracle how it's changed.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
yeah.
W- Would you say, I guess what I was trying to get at is, yeah, I mean, it's really impressive how. you're not the first person that had mentioned hope as being, you look at the camps and you see there is something there. Um, I I guess I just want to, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your work that you've done. Um, Robert always mentions that if it wasn't for the people that really really stuck their hand out to help the Cambodian refugees, I mean, many, many lives would have been lost. And so sometimes I think you're working 7 days a week. What kept you going? What kept you helping? What kept you giving?
Well, I was a lot younger. So I think just sometimes stopping and realizing that I'm here, history, something that people are going to be talking about and writing about for decades to come. But also, I felt a bit of responsibility as an American who, I have to say, I'm very much left of center politically,
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the American war in Vietnam. Uh, I was out demonstrating when Nixon bombed Cambodia and invaded Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt a bit of responsibility of what my country had done to Cambodia, or what my country had done to Vietnam, or what
Mm-hmm.
my country had done to Laos. And this was a very small, a drop in the bucket sort of a way for me to say, Somto, I'm sorry, I'd like to help make make the situation. And although what I did is minuscule compared to this bigger picture, if you take my little bit and that person's little bit and that person's little bit, and you add them together, that's where you get this critical mass. So it's all of those little bits of hope together uh, that help turn things around, I think. But you're right. If there wouldn't have been this group of people that said, "Okay, I'm going to stop what I'm doing here in Germany, in the UK, in the US, in Australia, wherever, and go to Thailand and go to these camps and help out," Thai government hadn't agreed with the UN to set these camps up as Thailand. If it had only been those camps on the border where the Vietnamese could be bombing and invading, and where the Khmer Rouge were doing nasty stuff, and where the Thais were maybe thinking, we don't want all of this coming into Thailand. If it would have been
Right.
sandwiched there, then maybe Cambodia would be where Cambodia is today. And maybe your father wouldn't be where your father is today. And maybe you wouldn't be where you are today. So, you know, we're
Absolutely.
lucky. We're all lucky.
Absolutely. Well, I think, I say thank you, me personally, but I think I speak for all my listeners when I say thank you so much for the work that you've done. It's many, many years ago, and you talk of it as minuscule, but it really is not. As you mentioned, and my father mentioned, really, without the help of everybody else, I don't think anybody would have survived. And so I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time today.
We have Sua.
If if anybody wanted to find your work, Ken, do you have a kind of a hub
I
of
used to have a website, but because of COVID and me sort of being forced into retirement, I've taken that down. But if people want to look at my pictures and my little videos, I have an Instagram account. Don't
Mhm.
ask me what the name. I'll send you the link, as they say. Um, yeah, and
Well,
I
thank you again.
and I have a LinkedIn account so people can see the work that I've done over the years.
Sure, sure. I think you really have dedicated your life to so many wonderful organizations and wonderful causes. I mean, really, um, I'm in awe of what you have done. I looked at your resume and it was like 11 pages long of saving the world in different ways. So I really am appreciative of how you've dedicated your life to the work, including just what you've done
And
at
I would say
Kauai.
thank you, Dorothy, for doing what you're doing, because I really think it's very, very important, not just for young Khmer Americans, Khmer Aussies, Khmer French, whatever it may be, but for any person to know this story. It's very, very important. Because as they say, if we don't know history, we're going to do it all over again, and we want to avoid that. So thank you.
Right, right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay.